I love this lecture just because we're getting so many doses of different creativity. This next artist is a good example of that. An all-around creative person, knows how to do everything from draw and illustrate and everything, and he applies that into a medium to express himself in so many different ways. The artist is Daniel Sutliff. He's, like everyone else, probably grew up with some sort of creative influences that he's applied to his work.
Darshan, it's Ruperto.
Sorry, I'm looking at a different order. Thank you. Okay, sorry, this is Ruperto Hernandez. He is, if you guys are familiar with living arts, you're familiar with the Day of the Dead. This guy knows everything about the Day of the Dead. We got bios on everybody that they sent. And what I love the most about Roberto's bios is he says, "My purpose has always been to help my fellow humans find a self-connection with the flame of life." Just the way he describes that is a good example of his creativity. So let's hear it for Ruperto.
Vengan, que voy a decir una historia del Día de los Muertos. The video that you're watching actually is from an actual event in Mexico, and this is Day of the Dead. And I have a question for you. When you hear the words Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, what vision does that conjure up to you? Think about it a minute. You know, in Western civilization, we have this idea that somehow life and death are two separate events. You know, that somehow we're not supposed to connect living and dying. Well, the reality is, guess what, folks? It's the same thing. There's a saying in Mexico. It says, vida y muerte no son mundos contrarios. Somos un solo talo con dos flores jimenas. And what that means actually is that the reality is that life and death is on the same path. And that we're very similar to a single stem with two identical flowers on it. You know, when I read that, it really meant a lot to me, simply because my first introduction to Day of the Dead was when I was about 10 years old. I had a physical event where I was in a coma for about 6 days. And my grandmother, who was a huge influence in my life, she made a promesa to God that someday she was going to, if I lived, she was going to take me to Mexico, and that we were going to make a promise to God and go to an iglesia, a church there, that's called La Virgen de Guadalupe. And of course, obviously I lived. And we went to Mexico against my will, because you know, when you're a 10-year-old kid and your grandmother's dragging you along to a strange country that you know absolutely nothing about, being a Western American person. My grandmother being a curandera, which means a healer, and she was constantly stopping and telling stories to people and trying to help them understand what their life was all about. I was so totally disconnected, I just didn't understand what was going on. Well, when we got there, unbeknownst to me, the day we got there was the actual event of Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. And the vision that I remember is that in Mexico there's a mountain range that's right outside the city, and these people were coming down the side of the mountain. And they were all carrying candles and torches and fire. And it looked like a river of light that was coming down. And there were thousands of people that were coming to the city to celebrate Dia de los Muertos. And that's just what this event meant to me at that point as a child, was that it was about this spark of living, this light that we each and every one carries. And as you can see in this video, there's light that's just coming at you from all different directions. And they actually do all of this in the cemetery. So they go to the cemetery, they clean all the grave sites off, everybody brings food, and wine and beer and music, and they all celebrate. And they pass out and they wake up and they celebrate some more. And they pass out and they wake up and they celebrate, and they keep doing this for days. And my collaborator here is putting together an altar that's very similar to the altars that you'll see in the video. And the idea is that there are 3 different connections that you make here. The bottom section being the connection of humans to the dead. The center section being that it's all the food and the things that they imbibed while they were alive. And then the top is actually the deity. And as you can see in the video, you can see how all these things are connected. The thing that I found very interesting when I was later introduced to Day of the Dead, after years of course, was that I had several friends that had died from AIDS, and I wanted to reconnect with them, and I wasn't sure how I was going to do that. And I remembered as a child this event that I had gone to in Mexico with my grandmother, Dia de los Muertos. And so I decided to commemorate their deaths in my backyard, and there were several hundred people that showed up at my house. And we did a burning and commemorated them with a huge altar. And in this particular altar, you'll see there's a couple of things that I used in that altar, but it meant a lot to me to commemorate their living. And I guess the most important thing to me, really, about Day of the Dead is that there's a saying that says, nacer es solamente comenzar a morir, which means that to be born is just the beginning of dying. And, you know, in Western civilization, we disconnect ourselves so much from people that have passed on. You know, you go at a funeral and you weep and you commemorate their death. And then you talk about their life and, you know, their purpose. And then you leave the cemetery and you never return. You know, it's almost like we totally forget who they are. And that's what's so important about this event of Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos. It's a commemoration. It's making a connection with all these men and women that went before us, that gave their life so that we could continue. Everybody's got somebody that influenced them. Everybody's got somebody that meant something to them, that gave them something. And I think if there's nothing else that you don't get from Day of the Dead, it's that one piece.